Hello and welcome to Nesta Talks 2, our conversational event series with interesting thinkers where we focus on the big issues that will define our future. I'm Madeline Gabriel, I'm the Sustainable Future Director at Nesta, and I'm going to be your host for today's conversation with Magid Magid. Now, before I introduce our guest, I'd just like to explain the format of the session. Magid and I are going to kick things off for about 30 minutes where we'll be having a conversation and then we'll open up to your questions. So please do join the conversation throughout by using the comments box. I think it's on the right-hand side of your screen. Feel free to chat, feel free to add questions, and we'll come to them in the second half of the session. And if you'd like closed captions, they can be accessed via a link in the stream to this link in the description, basically to this stream. So, who's Magid? Well, he's a Somali-British race and climate justice activist, organiser and author. And he came to the UK as a refugee aged 5. He's founder and director of the Union of Justice. He was a member of the European Parliament representing Yorkshire and the Humber. And many of us will know him from his time as Lord Mayor of Sheffield. He's also been an elected councillor. And his book, The Art of Disruption, a Manifesto for Real Change, came out last year. I've had the pleasure of reading a copy. It's full of really interesting stories sort of behind the principles that have guided his approach. Great insight into Magid's values and just some really cool nuggets like things like hard work plus sacrifice plus courage plus opportunity minus shit throwing equals achieving your goals. So I'm just really looking forward to this discussion. Magid, welcome.
Lovely to be speaking with you, Madeline. It's a real joy. Thank you very much for having me.
How are you today?
I am good, thank you very much. It's always sunny in Sheffield, but honestly,
Sheffield, that's not.
Yeah, honestly, everything's good. I'm just midway. All is good. I'm going to be heading out, catching up with some friends later on, but feeling good. How are you doing?
I'm all right, thank you. I'm feeling a little bit hay feverish, so I'm just hoping I'm not going to break into sneezing and coughing during our session. So I've got loads of things I want to cover today, so I'm going to just sort of jump straight in. So we've set up this discussion with this kind of intriguing notion that a global pandemic is a good time to tackle climate breakdown. Why is that?
Well, I guess to answer the question, like the truth is that the climate crisis and the pandemic are really intertwined in so many different ways, and I think as a result it really makes sense that we tackle them both together. So if you can ask what the connections are, so they are both a calamity that recognizes no borders. They both require collaboration between countries without exception, and they both have absolutely no care for economic consideration whatsoever. And it also kind of really, sadly, disproportionately devastates the already disadvantaged people, and they kind of also really just compel policymakers to choose between people and profits. Yeah. And they're just basically some examples that really show the parallels between the two perils of coronavirus and climate catastrophe, and it really couldn't be any clearer. And I guess although it being, should we say, infinitely tragic, the pandemic has really made apparent what pre-COVID regularly kind of overlooked. So, for example, those who have disregarded, shall we say, the notion of limitless government spending as unfeasible, citing the ever elusive deficit, which many people tend not to talk about as much nowadays. I've kind of since seen the depths to which government's monetary and fiscal policy can really be extended when it's desperately needed. So basically those who were, shall we say, previously trapped in a race to the bottom of society, stripped of empathy, and kind of have really since found a strength to kind of slow down and just see the interconnectedness of all of us and basically everything around us. And basically, those who really deemed climate activism as some sort of middle class fancy activity, but thankfully now through critical and refined concepts such as the Green New Deal, which many people have been talking about recently, have really, I guess, become privy to the relationship between, shall we say, the fuel that you put in your car and the ability to put food on the table, and just how it's kind of interlinked basically. So yeah, it is massively interlinked, and I think now more than ever, given everything that's been happening, I think people are seeing what's like a real opportunity to really change things and not go back to what things were before.
Yeah, so you've mentioned a couple of things there, like I suppose it brings home, as you say, the kind of interconnectedness of things, the need to kind of tackle big problems that cross borders together, and also change people's thinking, I suppose, a bit like, as you said, with national spending, debt and deficit, like, when we really need to, we can find the money, right? So, are there other opportunities it sort of it
Yeah,
opens up?
because it was just like, I just remember, like, it feels like everything that we were told, because remember, like we said, why can't we house all the homeless people, right? Then the pandemic hit, then we housed all the homeless people, and then we borrowed. So it's like everything we were told wasn't possible, all of a sudden was possible, kind of thing. So as we know, it takes political will.
Yeah, yeah. And what about a couple of things to mention, like, so obviously there's been a huge amount of rhetoric around things like building back better. I mean, that came back right from the start of the pandemic, I think, and not just in this country, but that type of phrase you see elsewhere. And obviously there's been lots of changes in people's lives, like lifestyle. Do you think any of that, is a real opportunity? Does it sort of give us like yeah, chance to do things differently, or do you see things probably sort of slipping back to what they were before? What do you think?
Yeah, I guess there's quite a few different opportunities, and I guess especially as vaccines are being rolled out across the world, like attention is what it feels like anyway is now turning to how the global economy can be rebooted, shall we say. And of course, at the same time, like with unemployment soaring and the economic hardship absolutely mounting everywhere, many people and leaders will and are sadly currently are facing a lot of pressure to reinstate business as usual, and especially and as quickly as possible at that as well. But of course, we all know that doing like it just seems like it's not a neutral act, and of course, it would not like it's in my opinion anyway. It would like in fact like be an active, shall we say, active decision to deepen our environmental crisis, and of course, like restoring the status quo after defeating COVID-19 would be like celebrating beating lung cancer by smoking 100 cigarettes, basically. So like the cure for the disease is and it should never be the cause. That can never be the cure, basically. And of course, like I guess should we say like in regards to like when we talk about new opportunities, like the upshot is the pandemic has shown that it is possible to radically completely restructure economies on short timescales, of course, provided, of course, that there is the political will to do so. And we've all had we've heard of many countries promising, as you kind of mentioned, like to build back better from the pandemic. It feels as if like this rhetoric must really be matched with reality. So, for example, like if the pandemic itself cannot cure the environmental crisis, the way we restructure the recovery from it must and certainly should basically help us with that. So I guess what I'm trying to say is instead of spending billions to return national economies to their destructive paths, like our government in the UK and others like must really instead forge a different path of really unleashing a vast program of investment to decarbonize the global economy as fast as it is feasibly possible and bring about environmental footprint within fair and sustainable limits. And let's be honest, right? Countries in the global north, UK being one of the major ones, that have played a disproportionate role contributing to the environmental breakdown, have a moral obligation to lead by example. And of course, even though I haven't got much faith in our in our government at the moment, but basically while also like really supporting a global just transition, because the thing is we in the we can just think the UK as a problem. So say, for example, even if the UK had the best Green New Deal, right? And not only just the UK, Europe had the best European Green New Deal, it still wouldn't be enough to tackle the climate crisis. That's why it's really imperative that we have a global approach to everything that we're doing. And as well as placing the global economy on a more sustainable path, like this would really, in my opinion, create a new wave of high-skilled, low-carbon jobs. And crucially, I believe, it would also make future outbreaks of animal-borne diseases such as COVID-19 really far less likely. And I know And I know, of course, like some will always have the question of like if we can afford such a massive undertaking. But the pandemic, like as we said, has really shown that affordability is always a political constraint and not necessarily a technical one.
Yeah.
So like central banks have like created, of course, like trillions of pounds and dollars to prop up economies throughout the crisis, redirecting even a fraction, even if we redirect a fraction of those towards green investments, it could really put us on track to try to meet our temperature goals. And yeah, I honestly think it's possible. And like even now, like the interest rates, as people talk about, like are at massively record lows. So there has really never been a better time to turbocharge our green transition. And the question should never really be like whether we can afford this or not, where it should be whether we can afford not to do it or not. And I can't help but think about, the financial crash in 2008 when we bailed out the banks. I don't know, like maybe this is a time we should really consider like bailing out the planet. But just a thought anyway, Madeline.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, what do you think of? I mean, you mentioned the European Green New Deal and kind of the UK policies. Like, what do you think? What do you think of them at the moment? Like, what are they getting right, and where are the gaps?
Yeah. So I guess in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, governments around the world are turning to like Green New Deals as some sort of win-win solution to both the economic crisis and the climate catastrophe. But the thing is, like, nowhere is it more apparent than in the, shall we say, all-encompassing European Green Deal. Like, so for example, like one of the kind of main criticisms that you get from the European Green Deal is that, and I guess not even just with the European Green Deal, but like other versions like it generally fall into like three categories. So the first one is that the European Green Deal clings onto the idea that absolute decoupling of economic growth and environmental impact is possible. So in other words, the plan basically assumes that we can achieve green economic growth at the same time as dramatically reducing CO2 emissions, which is just complete BS. The second one is like, the second criticism is that it has a blind faith in technology. So like what I'm trying to say is like of course renewables are without a doubt a huge improvement on fossil fuels, but they lock us into multiple dependencies on scarce raw materials, and this really kind of leads to a shortage of lithium, cobalt, nickel, and other kind of rare metals. I think they predict by the year 2050, and elements that are mainly concentrated in countries like your Democratic Republic of Congo, Chile, and Indonesia. And this would, of course, cause severe impacts for those communities already suffering under extractivism. And the third criticism he kind of gets is, I guess that the framework, shall we say, promoted by the likes of the European Green Deal subordinates the public interest to private gain. So you'll have like the availability of massive public funds like the EU 750 billion pound post-pandemic recovery instrument. But that's like prompted large energy companies like your BPs, Shells, to speed up their greenwashing, to kind of really then present themselves as essential actors in the recovery and transition. So even like the structure of funds themselves effectively squeezes out other actors such as your small and your medium-sized enterprises. Reason being, like, the timelines are too fast, the funding volumes are too large, and the process is honestly just a bit too bureaucratic in itself. And I think one of the examples is that in Spain, one of the large funding that they kind of got, large consultants that kind of got it was Deloitte, and they've basically been given a big contract to run a lot of these, and it just feeds kind of into that whole kind of narrative. And so I guess in terms of like what kind of Green New Deal do we need that we kind of like what I think would actually work is, well, more and more people, shall we say, are realizing that we need to emerge from the pandemic with healthy public services, properly valued care and domestic and work, and just like a sustainable and just economy. But it's kind of becoming more clear that the European Green Deal will not really deliver on this promise. However, there are really things that are really optimistic, like proposals offered by social movements, which are often, the results of years of painstaking work by charities, civil society groups, offer like a really more hopeful one. And to give you an example, like there's an organization called Green New Deal for Europe, which is promoted by European activists and researchers, which really proposes putting the care economy, public services, and participatory democracy center stage of everything. So like instead of the kind of current obsession with economic growth and financial economy, especially in response to COVID-19 pandemic, one of the things that they've basically called for is really interesting things like the creation of a European healthcare standard, a minimum income for carers, and a 4-day kind of working week. So it kind of basically leaves many who kind of care about the environment, environmental emergency in some sort of bind. Like, should we support the green deals being offered by existing governments as the only realistic route to change, or should we reject them for, basically being co-opted from the start, so it's therefore doomed to failure? So there's I think there's a two-track approach that we can take to it.
Yeah, I might come back to that actually, because it does seem like a bit of a central tension, particularly at the moment. But I thought this might be a good sort of moment to sort of move on to what you're doing now. So you founded an organisation called Union of Justice. Tell us about it. What to do?
Well, so Union of Justice, we're an independent people of colour-led organisation that's dedicated to the intersection between racial justice and climate justice. And of course, we maintain there's a clear and crucial connection between both. We can't talk about the climate crisis without recognising it's also an inequality and race issue. And we're basically made up of a team of activists, researchers, artists, and elected representatives from across Europe. And there's 3 main pillars that we have. So number one, we empower people, where we building a vibrant people of colour network across Europe, where we facilitate training so those most affected by the climate crisis are equipped with the skills and the knowledge to bring about change in their community. Second pillar is influence. And as we say, we're not a neutral organisation. We can't afford to be neutral. So we openly and proudly advocate for positions and policies that in any way promote racial equality and climate justice. And our third pillar is change, where we basically campaign for radical change. And in everything, it's a source of engagement with the public and the gel that kind of connect in each of our operations. So whether that be rebutting eco-fascist narratives or pushing for a globally aware, just and European Green New Deal.
And you've mentioned this a bit, but can you tell us any more about the links between racial justice and climate justice? I mean, it might seem obvious, but it'd be wonderful to sort of set it out.
Yeah, so the effects of the climate crisis everywhere are massively unequal and unfair. It was created by the privileged few, mainly by global north, but it is sadly hitting the global south and ethnic minorities, even in the global north, and marginalized communities the hardest. And honestly, without a radical and rapid change, of course, this unjust trend, it kind of just adds itself to the already other profound historic injustices Black and brown communities and marginalized communities across the board and across the country really already confronts. So we also it's just important to basically ensure that centralized projects, whether that be policies, decisions regarding any climate action, really don't worsen injustices Black and brown people already kind of face. So it's, as we say, it's important to emphasize that climate justice and climate transition demands that we are not just kind of talking about it, but it's just an inclusive and diverse in outlook. Just to kind of give you one example, is it's a sad example of the tragic death of Elekisa Debri, which many people would have kind of come across, who was a 9-year-old girl from South London who died from air pollution. It's just another example of how poor communities, which frequently are also ethnic minorities, are often concentrated around main roads in major cities, suffer consequences of decisions made by people who often have absolutely no idea of their plight. They have the dirtiest industries in their backyards, and many of the young people are starting to kind of suffer from asthma. And even if we kind of look at green spaces, for example, right? Green spaces should be accessible to as many people as possible. And it's even been proven that you are more likely to visit green spaces if you do not have to travel far to reach it. Yeah. But, sadly, it isn't accessible to many people. And it's been said that someone's postcode is a better predictor of their health than anything else. And if we really deep and even kind of really look into it, where people live has been shaped by a long history of racial discrimination, both explicit and implicit. And even like national government, our national government, as well as local governments for that fact, have often invested in improving, shall we say, a neighborhood by planting trees, building parks, generally beautifying the area while completely neglecting other areas. And yeah, I like class does also play a big role in this, as the nature gap is directly correlated to the wealth gap as well. So the injustices are really everywhere.
I said we go to comments after our chat, but there's one here from David Brockway. He says, could you speak a little bit more about eco-fascist narratives, because he's not heard the term before. Since we're talking about that. What is it? We lost Magid. I think we might have just lost Magid briefly. We'll get him back. I think I'm probably not best to explain eco-fascism, but and I'll let him do it when he gets back. But I have read a little bit about it, and I think it's a sort of almost a conflation of climate positive campaigning with nationalism. So an idea that, for example, that immigrants are to blame for climate crisis in some way. For example, the overpopulation is to blame, and there's been some really horrible things shared online, things like bees, not refugees, and so on. So it's kind of a sort of white supremacist version of eco-activism, and I think it's not hugely mainstream at the moment. But one issue that I've been looking at as the mission director at Nesta is kind of to what extent environmentalism is a kind of potentially the new front in the culture war. And I think there is some element of that kind of coming through. So some element that, either that on the one hand, pushing for net zero, or pushing for carbon emissions reductions is a kind of an elite agenda that sort of doesn't speak to the masses and kind of has some sort of conspiracy behind it, or this kind of at the other end of the scale, an idea of eco-fascism. So kind of conflating white nationalism with climate breakdown. We are working to get Magid back. These are the joys of online events. While we're waiting for Magid to come back, I would really highly recommend the Union of Justice website to explore some of these issues in a bit more detail, because they've got a great section on resources which has videos of people talking about a number of these issues in some depth and very knowledgeably as well. So there's a great video on the relationship between climate justice and racial justice, which does touch on eco-fascist narratives. And there's a whole range of other resources on there, which I'd highly recommend to you as viewers. Are there any? If anyone else would like to ask a question, then we could discuss some things before we get Magid back. I'm reliably assured that he's on his way. It's always interesting as a host not being able to see who you're talking to. We've got a great question from Magid coming through, which I'll ask him when we get him back. One of the things I'm quite interested in talking to Magid about and getting his views on is around the I guess we've talked a bit about the connection between. Oh, you're all back.
I guess literally the internet kind of cut out for some reason, so sincere apologies.
No worries. Hopefully they can edit me kind of ad-libbing out about a video of this later. I was just trying to explain a little bit about how I understood eco-fascism, and I learned a little bit on that from some of the videos on Union of Justice website, which I've recommended to our viewers. But yeah, you were just talking about eco-fascism, so let's pick up again there.
Yeah, so it's like, I guess it's interesting because different people interpret ecofascism in different kind of ways. But in a sense, it's like the ideology where like environmentalism, that kind of like everyone should adopt environmental friendly lifestyles, irrespective of their personal wishes, preferences, or needs. And that's where you get like certain conversations about like we need to reduce the population, and kind of therefore it really kind of just affects sub kind of section of society, and it's a kind of extreme kind of method really. And it's kind of like you tend to like interestingly kind of see it a lot in kind of like South American countries, and so it's kind of being a more kind of a popularized term.
Yeah, okay. So I might have mischaracterized it a bit, because I was saying I saw it as a kind of conflation of sort of eco-activism with almost like white nationalism or white supremacy.
It was massively linked with that as well. And one of the kind of like, it kind of recently came to like, you had the guy who sadly like who murdered all those people in New Zealand in Christchurch, and he put out a manifesto of like all these kind of right-wing extremist views, and one of them was basically eco-fascist kind of tendencies kind of thing, which basically is linked to white supremacy. So it's a growing trend between far-right groups basically.
Yeah. Okay. And yeah, I was also reflecting a little bit on the extent to which climate activism and kind of concern for the environment and sort of a willingness to kind of support policies towards carbon reduction or net zero are or aren't a front in the culture war. And I kind of think it's sort of it's not, in my view, it's not become a massive culture war issue yet, but you can sort of see some kind of emerging dangerous shoots, right? And I guess eco-fascism also, the adoption of some of these narratives by far-right groups could be one of those. But I've got another question for you. I'm going to, from the audience, since I can ask people to submit comments while you're away. And one from Anthony Lee, who says, will Union of Justice be developing a platform for people of colour to share their knowledge and cultural relationship with the natural world to challenge the current extractive economic psychological framework?
Yeah, so currently we've got thanks for the question, Anthony. So currently we've got a network of around 1,200 people from across Europe, mainly like people of colour. And yeah, it is literally just a kind of space where we kind of discuss different ideas, exchange different resources. But the interesting thing is of course, climate justice in Sweden looks very different to climate justice in Spain. And every country is kind of different. So at the same time, there's a lot that we can learn from each other. So we do kind of use it as, of course, we run, as well as kind of just doing events, we kind of hold kind of regular kind of events and meetings where we kind of just get people together. And of course, one of the issues as well is trying to do something across different countries. Language at times can be a barrier. So of course, like at times we rely on people speaking English, but we also do have to have like French, Spanish, and Italian interpreters just to try and break as much barriers down as possible. So yeah, so it's we kind of just answer your question. We kind of share knowledge and kind of cultural relationships. So I was wondering if anyone's interested, I kind of encourage them to kind of go on the website and kind of just sign up to our kind of like members, so we'll kind of send information out there.
Yeah, makes sense. I want to go back to something that you raised earlier then about the sort of tension between wanting to push for a kind of sort of a version of climate and racial justice that kind of believe in, and also seeing these sort of policy initiatives that aren't really it, but go some of the way. How do you approach that? Like, if you can see things that are sort of pushing in the right direction but not going far enough, is it better to support them or to push for what you really think should?
So we think in terms of like.
Your comment on the Green New Deal, for example.
Yeah. So I guess like it's like if we want to tackle the climate crisis and achieve a just transition that really addresses global gender and racial inequalities, we kind of need to recognize the strength of both approaches. Mm-hmm. So I guess in a technical sense, the version like the civil society versions, the one that organizations and like charging people do is far superior. And about that, so let's just kind of be like it's far superior than the other kind of Green New Deals that other people kind of governments kind of push. But what, for example, the European Green Deal does and has, which others don't, is short-term achievability. Like for example, it already exists, and its ability to reach a wide and diverse audience in the short term, like, really can't be underestimated, especially given the timeline we have to put brakes on the climate catastrophe. It's really important. So instead of, like, I kind of think at times, like, instead of stubbornly picking sides, like, maybe it's just the kind of best to adopt a two-track strategy. Like, we should of course advocate to improve existing Green New Deals everywhere, while simultaneously supporting those proposing a more radical restructuring of our economy. After all, like, the ambition of the original New Deal, which was spurred by protests from the working class in the United States, just as various Green New Deals appeared at a time of historic and climate mobilization, then as well as now, like, there is no institutional ambition without popular mobilization. And yeah, we need to mobilize, and we really sadly haven't got much time to waste.
Yeah. Okay. One more question on this sort of topic, but in your book you are, I think, a bit critical of the UK's net zero commitment. I think you kind of say, well, it's lacking detail. You know, there's potential, it's sort of a bit watered down, like your potential to kind of achieve it by paying other countries to cut their emissions, and it's so long term that, you know, it can sound really good politically, but, you know, it doesn't really spur much action. And sometimes some of the pushback I see on the net zero policies here is that, you know, people will say, oh, well, you know, the UK only contributes 1% of global emissions, so is it even worth us doing anything about it? Like, is there value in countries making their own commitments when we need to tackle climate change globally? And, you know, what's your view of, like, what can we and should we try and do here, and what do we need to do in collaboration with others?
I think, yeah, it's, you know, as you said, I think of, like, COP26, which many people dub as, like, the last chance COP. And of course, like, there is definitely value in countries, like, having their own commitments. Of course, it was, like, legally binding commitments, whatever, but I think it's like, it's, people are just at a stage where it's like, we've had it enough of the talk. We know what the issues are, but we just need to kind of get on with it. And of course, this is something we can't do by ourselves. Of course, we want each country to kind of have its own commitments. We also need to kind of work collaboratively, because it's a global fight, because it's one of the few things that affects everybody. Of course, it affects people disproportionately more than others, but it is a global problem. And it's the one thing that kind of, like, we've got in common is our kind of planet. So of course, it is something we kind of work on together. And, like, of course, you think COP is a great place to kind of really get together and try to really have something kind of concrete kind of thing. And of course, a lot of it as well, it has to be, as I kind of mentioned earlier, is it can't be like, this is what we're doing in the global north. We're doing our part. Everyone else kind of needs to take care of itself, which is what Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, said, because it's responsible of every other country, which is, we know it's completely not, it's not true, because, like, we can't look at this as a one, like, we've done our bit and that's it kind of thing. But but the thing is, it's like, it does need to have, like, of course, you need to have, like, influence. You need to, like, we need the grassroots and organizations and people to kind of do the, like, it's going to require the effort of every single, because we can't just rely and put it into the hands of elected representatives. They can be like, yeah, they'll kind of sort out our mess, but it's not going to happen. So yeah, there's many different, and honestly, there's loads of examples of where people are collaborating, whether that be sharing data, whether that be, like, coming up with solutions. It is just something that is, like, we need to have everyone's input and approach to it.
Yeah. Okay, that takes me on to the next question, because I'm going to ask a bit about the role of individuals, not just people. You know, what can we do? And I was going to sort of frame it by saying, well, quite often when we talk about tackling climate breakdown, there's quite a lot of emphasis, I suppose, on what you might read in the media or whatever, on individual behaviours and choices. So, like, what we should all be doing differently, you know, driving an electric car, eating less meat or whatever. But some people, on the other hand, would say that's completely misplaced, because climate breakdown is caused by global structural forces, like investment of billions in fossil fuels by the UK, the world's biggest banks, and so on. So my first question is, like, can individuals make a difference? And secondly, what should we be focusing on? Is this about our individual behaviours and choices, or about political action, or something in between, or all of that?
Yeah, you know, like, it is a bit frustrating, I'm not going to lie, because it's always like, the little man they need to sort everything. Of course, like everybody can go get rid of plastic straws. That's not going to stop what we saw when the whole entire sea was on fire. Was it like last week or something? Like, it's like, how many more dystopian nightmares are we going to have to watch kind of play out on a kind of news feeds before our elected representatives and leaders can like really just sum up the courage to kind of act and be like, yeah, we can't play both sides on this. Like, there really isn't any future like being like on a fossil fuel dependent economy. So of course it's everybody can do something. Like, it's, I don't know, like, if you're a comedian, do some funny content, bring awareness. If you're a writer, write. Like, if whatever it is that your God-given talent is, there is something for you to basically, if you've got money, donate to worthwhile causes, lobby basically your elected representatives, go out and disrupt kind of thing, like whatever it is. But the thing is that we can't afford not to do anything kind of thing. Of course, it's not something that's like, it's that ordinary, like, it's not like I said, we can recycle all we want. It's not going to be enough, basically, right? I think the emphasis I try to get at that is we can't afford to be indifferent about it, right? And I think it was it the philosopher and Heschel that said, indifference is more insidious than evil itself, kind of thing. So basically, we just can't get it. Is we can't afford to kind of like, even if it like it doesn't affect us at the moment, because one of the narratives which I always kind of push back on is when people say, oh, we need to do this to protect our future. Like, whose future? Like, for a lot of these people, is real life is happening right now, kind of thing. Like, there are people, like, they predicted by the year 2050 it's going to be over 200 million people who are going to be displaced from their homes, right? Currently, even in the South Pacific, there are people who actually had to leave their islands, their homes, because it's flooded and it's underwater. And you're like, well, how do we even like come to repopulate an entire community into somewhere else? Like, there's so many things that are literally, there's droughts happening like all across. It's like, why do we have to wait until it hits us to kind of like, for us to kind of do something? But it also kind of like, I don't know, there was an interesting book about it where they basically had the idea of setting up like a ministry for the future, kind of thing. Like, really like, okay, these things are going to happen. Instead of just reacting to it, how can we get ahead of it, basically plan? So how do we really like populate people? All these kind of things that are going to happen, how do we kind of prepare for it? For example, like, from the little bit of internet research that I did, the only country that kind of compensates if you to lose your house to a climate disaster is France. They will actually pay you money, like they'll kind of pay your house if your house gets done. But that's like, it's even like legislation and law. It's all really far behind. There's nothing like there's so much work that kind of needs to be done, and there's so many like interesting organizations. There's one organization that really predicts where climate conflicts will take place in the future. So it kind of maps out all the risks and be like, there's going to be a like conflict over water in this area, and they kind of try and mitigate those risks before it kind of happens. So there's always kind of interesting things like that happen all the time where people are working collaboratively together and stuff. So it's, we need more of it for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that actually links to a question we've had through the comments. Kind of, would you recommend any young activists you're working with? So this is from Marika Navin. Who you tell us about sort of exciting stuff you're seeing and hearing. Who should we be following, for example? Yeah,
so like, it's honestly like just the other day, for example, like there was a couple of like young activists that group of like young Muslim activists from a school in Sheffield, and they really like, because again it's this whole thing of like, let's be honest, the climate movement is predominantly white dominated, and it's got a history of it is so that a lot of time it's being focused on environmentalism, never really kind of looked at it from an intersectional approach. So what's interesting is like the young people, the youth, are the ones who are the catalyst, like, for so much different input, for so many different changes. And these group of young Muslim lads, they kind of were talking to their parents about the climate crisis and how basically we need to kind of do something about it. And the way they kind of related to their parents, what worked for them is their parents are immigrants from Bangladesh and others like populations from the global south, and kind of like it was something that their parents could kind of relate to, kind of thing, because they see what's happening in native countries. And as a result, their parents then kind of brought it up to the local imam in the mosque, and then the imam literally used the Friday sermon to solely talk about the climate crisis, which is not a topic you tend to hear about in religious sermons, kind of thing. And then you've literally even like religious groups have got such a big role that they can kind of play. in terms of, that could be a whole different discussion in terms of like, can God save us or whatever kind of thing, but it's like the religious they play a real influential role. And in this, like in America, they definitely do, the evangelicals, and they definitely, but religion as a whole has got a big role to play. And Pope Francis even actually wrote an op-ed piece about climate and religion, which was really, really interesting. But there's honestly so many amazing groups of, mainly majority young people kind of thing. And especially at a time like this, of course, we tend not to hear about as much along the time, because like even like globally, you've got like, I know we've all heard of Greta Thunberg, who is an amazing champion. There's so many other people like Zia Bastida, like you've got Ilma Hurt, you've got so many different people doing amazing kind of things. Vanessa in Uganda, like it's and like it's one of the things we do at Uni Justice is really try and champion and like promote those voices as much as possible.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. There's a question from Anne Biggs, who says, there is a lot of discussion about the climate crisis and how it affects marginalised members of society, either by geography, class and race. I found less on the impact of women. Do you have any further info?
Honestly, I will probably be the best person to kind of speak to, but in any society, like it's, of course, within that, women also kind of massively suffer. And like, one of my colleagues was doing a bit of research, and there's loads of kind of papers written about in terms of like how the climate crisis massively disimpacts women, especially like mainly like in a lot of kind of global south countries where women hold different social roles compared to men and stuff like that. So yeah, it's something, it is a fact that it definitely does negatively impact women more, but I don't know much detail on that.
That's that. So we talk about sort of activism. I love the idea of like just use whatever talent you've got. If you're a comedian, do some comedy. If you're a writer, write. Like, what would you say you've learned from your time as an activist so far? What are your tips if someone wanted to get started?
So I think the first thing I kind of learned is like, it's three main valuable lessons, and I've kind of learned, which I always reflect on basically. So first lesson I kind of learned on is that courage is contagious. Like, honestly, like we should really never underestimate like the impact that we can have on others. And of course, as every time that we choose to take a stand, every time we choose to challenge the status quo or do things differently, like not only does that help take a life of its own, but it really, really like excites and empowers all those around you. So it's really important to really take a stance to kind of make a difference, whether that be in your workplace or whatever it is, kind of thing. Just taken that bold kind of stance is really important that I found. And the second, shall we say, the lesson that I learned is, from a personal point of view, like cake is a coping mechanism. Like for me anyway, so like listen, we all need coping mechanisms, right? Like to see the hope, and not to really, at times, just even to stop us from going numb, like whatever that be. Like, I know people do yoga, praying, whatever it is. Like personally for me, like despite what my dentist or my waistline tells me, it's just eating cake and puddings, basically, right? But basically, on the serious point of it, it's like it's really important to take care of each other and really kind of have each other's back, because it can be really tiring, and you kind of have to make sure that you're looking after yourself before you have to help yourself before you can help others. Yeah. And in the world of activism, you can easily burn yourself out, kind of thing, easily. So it's also kind of knowing that you don't have to do things alone. Like whatever you're passionate about, regardless of whatever niche it is, there'll be a community for you, whether that be in your local community. If not, there's an online community somewhere, but you don't have to do things alone. And then the third kind of lesson I learned is just compassion. Like regardless of what career or line of work you're in, like compassion really should be central at the heart of everything that we do. Like, yes, of course, we are living through polarizing, difficult times where we may encounter events, words, people that absolutely infuriate us. But if, like, we need to be strong, like we need to be understanding, we need to work collaboratively. We also kind of really need to show compassion, because compassion is the ultimate manifestation of strength. And for me, that is something that really kind of is like the bedrock of everything that I do.
Yeah, it comes through really strongly in your book, like how you sort of use that like throughout your career so far. Like one of the other things that struck me when I was reading your book was around sort of creativity. Like, when you talk quite a lot about, sort of being faced with a problem, like, I've got to, have my picture taken as new Lord Mayor, or, people are writing into me asking, what I'm going to do, and you kind of come up with something really sort of creative and different as a way of approaching it, like asking people to sort of escort you around the city. Like, how do you do that? Like, is it because you're an amazing creative person, or like, do you have any kind of tips?
Do you know what is, Madeline? I kind of go back to a quote that Maya Angelou said, which I'm going to butcher, but she said something along the lines of, people don't necessarily remember what you say or do, but they remember how you make them feel. So, excuse me. So I always try and think, how can I engage people on an emotional level to make them do something? Like, it's like I sometimes think of, like, there's a reason why, like, Martin Luther King didn't say, I've got a 10-point plan. He goes, I have a dream. Like, he was really trying to invoke emotion to get people to act, to do something, especially, in an age where people's attention spans are short and there's so much information out there. I always try and think of, how can I grab their attention, but how can I, like, emotionally, like, get the, like, engage on an emotional level to kind of do things, which then kind of really forces me to think outside the box. Of course, you're not going to get things right all the time, but it is just this thing of, like, okay, this is how traditional things are being done. Like, for example, there's a campaign like the All Grieve Truth and Justice campaign in South Yorkshire, Miners campaign, right, in Sheffield. Everyone's like, listen, and I want to support this campaign. I was like, oh, just write to Sajid Javid, who was, like, the Home Secretary at the time. Right, I'm like, why is Sajid Javid going to read my letter? He gets hundreds of letters, right? And I kind of, not only kind of, like, it wasn't necessarily for him, so I just thought to myself, okay, I'm going to write a letter, but I'm going to do it on Yorkshire Day, which was the 1st of August. So I wrote it in a very Yorkshire dialect, which was quite ridiculous and quite funny, but it was like, and it made the news, and people writing, people said, is it appropriate for somebody to write to the Home Secretary in a very, but it did its job. Its job was to get people's attention, to get people talking about this campaign. But had I followed the normal traditional way of just writing to him, Saj would have replied back to me. Nobody would have cared, or nobody. Just kind of just emotionally, just trying to engage people, like, whatever. It's just trying to just think, like, create. And I always think, like, creativity is, like, where we haven't got, like, resources of money or whatever. It's creativity kind of fills those gaps.
I was just trying to find it in your book, because I did love that bit. With the sort of, you're like, hey up, Saj.
So it's just like, just trying to, like, well, I guess it's any kind of line where, like, things, and the thing as well, it's like, it's people always really, like, I get it, like, it's wherever there's these kind of social constructs that we kind of have to fulfill and kind of live by, kind of thing. And it's like, if you're stepping out of the norm, it is uncomfortable. Like, it's uncomfortable to do that thing a bit differently or whatever. And for me, it's like, it's just a birth, like, honestly, like, it's just even that feeling of vulnerability, putting yourself out there, being vulnerable, is the birthplace of joy, the birthplace of change, the birthplace of so many different things. And I always try really lean into that kind of thing as much as possible.
I was going to ask you that, like, whether this, how difficult it is or not. Does it feel natural? And it's interesting you say it does make you feel vulnerable, because I'm quite introverted. So when I read some of your stories, like, going up and talking to Dee on the bus, and making that brilliant connection with her, and you had that sort of, you found out later you had a real impact on this woman's kind of, like, well-being, really. And I thought, oh God, talking to people on the bus.
You know what is, Madeline? Well, it sounds really ridiculous, right? I just remember, whenever anything kind of scares me or something, right, I literally think to myself, when you kind of boil it down to reality, like, imagine nobody's going to give a shit about this next year. Like, it's such, like, I get it in the heat of the moment, you're like, oh my God, like, but the reality is, in a week's time, or yes, nobody's going to care, kind of thing, right? And it's like, the thing that is going to come down to, like, listen, the people that like me, people like the people that don't like me, you can't please everyone, is what I'm getting at. If you're trying to be everyone's cup of tea, you might as well be a mug. Because the thing is, it's like, it's you try and kind of fit and please everybody. And one of the things I'll never forget is, one of the kind of, somebody came up to me, was like, Magid, I hate everything you stand for, I disagree with everything you do, but I respect you because at least you stand up for what you believe in, and you, like, it's, so I'm saying, like, at least I've got that. You know what I'm saying? At least I can kind of be like that. And of course, like everybody else, I get the imposter syndrome in many different, like, where I'm like, God, like, it's nerve-wracking at times, kind of thing, but I'm just like, yeah, I'm just gonna do it and just be like, see what happens, kind of thing. And in the book, I make the quote of basically saying, like, there's so much traditions that we kind of have where people are like, you kind of stick to all the time, but they don't really question things. And I always question everything, because I guess even by virtue of questioning things, either it's a win-win situation. By that, what I mean is either I'll find out it's a really crap way of doing it and there's a different, better way to do it, or it'll kind of reaffirm why I kind of like, we kind of do this right. And of course, like it's like, we used to have like crap traditions, like where, by the way, when I say like it's do everything differently, there's certain things you shouldn't do differently, like CPR or like, right, there's certain things that are proven to work. But like when it comes to tradition, I say tradition is peer pressure from dead people. Right, but it's like, but it is. It's like it's people and actually then get stuck into this way and be like, oh, we need to like. But yeah, I just encourage you. I just always just try and do things differently. Just because, especially when you're trying to have a different outcome, if you keep doing the same things, like we can't expect a different outcome.
Yeah, definitely. What makes you optimistic? Are you optimistic?
Well, like it's. Many things make me hopeful and optimistic. Like, for example, like just knowing that nothing we see in the system that we were born into and are growing up in is natural. Like somebody decided things should be that way. And sometimes that's like, I have to think and kind of remember that somebody decided things have to be this way. So like the problems that we face didn't necessarily just come down from the heavens. Like they were made by bad human decisions. You can argue mainly by men in suits. So good human decisions can really change everything for the better. So it's honestly ordinary people, like day-to-day people influence me, like kind of like inspire me, like literally whether that be an NHS nurse, like my nephew's football coach, a young climate activists who are all like building a future that puts people on planet first. All of that kind of really makes me feel optimistic and kind of hopeful. And it's like, and I genuinely like truly believe like, especially the recent global events have like massively transformed what is politically possible, like the global pandemic, like the climate crisis, the fight against racism. They've all kind of exposed not only like the deep inequality within our society, but it's also proven why, like what many people have been saying, that we are only as secure as the most vulnerable amongst us. So like the arguments of like, our governments can't act, we can't do anything, all of that is kind of really starting to kind of really fall apart. So I think it's like, yeah, people are kind of seeing that and actually just demanding more than ever.
Well, if we were having this conversation in 10 years' time, like what would you want to have seen changed, or what do you hope might change?
I guess what we hope, because the thing is, it's like, honestly, you can't predict anything that's going to be happening, but I guess in 10 years' time, I'd like to think, well, that'll be like 2030, like we're carbon neutral. I'd like to think everyone, like, not only, it's like, not just a case of, we're just doing fine, we're surviving, but we don't want, and ideally, we'd be living in a world where we're also kind of thriving, where people kind of like, food banks are closed, we're not having to rely on food banks, like it's just that we, like, people on planet as a whole, kind of like we understand, we recognize, and we like adhere that we value people on planet, and like people on planet just kind of thriving. That's like, I know like it's a very vague answer, but I'm pretty sure the alternative is too bleak. Like it's like I can never like be in a state of despair, basically, right? It's like, I know, like, especially in this recent, like the amount of people I hear like that argue like, oh, like there's no point doing this, like government, even like people say governments are really weak and powerless, like there's little that I can do, like, and just people kind of just feel disempowered more than anything else, right? And I think like the realms of like what is possible is dramatically changing. I think people are starting to kind of realize that the alternative of sitting this one out is basically just too bleak, and people realizing we can't accept to kind of be in a constant state of despair, because not for ourselves, not for our family, not for our friends, not for our community, or our wider community, the planet as a whole. And we just have to do. So that's why it's like, everyone just do something, even if it's like having difficult conversations with your family and friends, even literally having conversation with your family and friends, that is at least doing something, because people sometimes think like, oh, I haven't got a fancy title as a Lord Mayor or an MEP. What can I do, kind of thing? Like, there's a lot that you can do. There's a lot that we can do, kind of thing. But it's just doing something.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, I don't know. Like for me, I'd love it. I'd love it if in 10 years' time we felt like we were getting on top of this. You know, like instead of always seeing bleak stories about something else that's awful that's happening in the world, we just
You
felt like
know,
things were moving in the right direction.
yeah, and you know as well, it's like it's in terms of like you hear a lot of people say like it's a lot of people just don't tend to connect or engage with the climate struggle as a more because a lot of the time their short-term needs out trumps what might happen in the future kind of thing, right? And also like of course, even though we see dystopian things like who would have ever thought we would have seen the ocean on fire? It was just such a like honestly, I thought it was a movie trailer to begin with, but the thing is it's like we have to really set a positive narrative, a real hopeful. And that's what attracts people. Like, of course, scaremonger, like it's a reality and it works and like it's got its place for it. But we're not going to get people on board by scaring them into like you can't scare people into doing things. But it is this real feeling of basically having to like set this real positive vision of what the world, what the future, what a more compassionate, sustainable Britain, Europe world looks like kind of thing. And by putting that real hopeful vision out there, that's what's going to attract people.
I think we'll need to draw it to a close in a minute. So I just want to go back to the point you've just made about doing something. If we're going to do something, if we, your listeners, we're going to do something tomorrow, like what should it be?
Honestly, like honestly just educate yourself. Like honestly, like read an article. Like, I'd like to maybe like I don't know in terms of like the people I hear if they're very kind of switched on or whatever. But even myself is a constant learning thing. I don't know everything. I'm always learning about different things, and it's an ongoing process. So at the very least, the more we could, for me, you just learn more. Like read a book, and get book on something, or like read an article or whatever. It's like there's podcasts. There's so many different mediums to learn, but it's just learn something you didn't know. Right? Just learn something. Someone asked a question about ecofascism. Learn about that. Read up on that. Just learn about something you already didn't know.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today.
No, thank you so much, Madeline. It's been a
really
real
fascinating.
pleasure.
Really good.